In a corner of the sitting room, leaning up against the back wall, stood my Marlin rifle with 10 cartridges in the magazine and one lying snugly in the greased breech. There was just time to get up to the house and take up a position of defense in that corner. Without an instant's hesitation, I ran up to the veranda, carefully picking my way among the trees as to avoid being seen in the light. Entering the room, I shut the door leading to the veranda and as quickly as possible turned out every one of the 6 lamps to be in a room so brilliantly lighted, where my every movement could be observed from outside, while I could see nothing but impenetrable darkness at every window, was by all laws of warfare an unnecessary concession to the enemy. And this enemy, if enemy it was to be, was far too wily and dangerous to be granted any such advantages. I stood in the corner of the room with my back against the wall and my hand on the cold rifle barrel. The table covered with my books lay between me and the door, but for the first few minutes after the lights were out, the darkness was so intense that nothing could be discerned at all. Then very gradually the outline of the room became visible and the framework of the windows began to shape itself dimly before my eyes. After a few minutes, the door, its upper half of glass, and the 2 windows that looked out upon the veranda became specially distinct. And I was glad that this was so, because if the Indians came up to the house, I should be able to see their approach and gather something of their plans. Nor was I mistaken, for there presently came to my ears a peculiar hollow sound of a canoe landing and being carefully dragged up over the rocks. The paddles I distinctly heard being placed underneath, and the silence that ensued thereupon I rightly interpreted to mean that the Indians were stealthily approaching the house. While it would be absurd to claim that I was not alarmed, even frightened, at the gravity of the situation and its possible outcome, I speak the whole truth when I say that I was not overwhelmingly afraid for myself. I was conscious that even at this stage of the night I was passing into a physical condition in which my sensations seemed no longer normal. Physical fear at no time entered into the nature of my feelings, and though I kept my hand upon the rifle the greater part of the night, I was at all times conscious that its assistance could be of little avail against the terrors that I had to face. More than once I seemed to feel, most curiously, that I was in no real sense a part of the proceedings, nor actually involved in them, but I was playing a part of a spectator moreover on a psychic rather on a material plane. Many of my sensations that night were too vague to define description and analysis, but the main feeling that will stay with me to the end of my days is the awful horror of it all, and the miserable sensation that if the strain had lasted a little longer than was actually the case, my mind must inevitably have given way. Meanwhile, I stood still in my corner and waited patiently for what was to come. The house was as still as the grave, but the inarticulate voices of the night sang in my ears, as I seemed to hear the blood running in my veins and dancing in my pulses. If the Indians came to the back of the house, they would find the kitchen door and window securely fastened. They could not get in there without making considerable noise, which I was bound to hear. The only mode of getting in by means of the door that faced me, and I kept my eyes glued on that door without taking them off for the smallest fraction of a second. My sight adapted itself every minute better to the darkness. I saw the table that nearly filled the room, and left only a narrow passage on each side. I could also make out the straight backs of the wooden chairs pressed against it, and could even distinguish my papers and inkstand lying on the white oilcloth covering. I thought of the gay faces that had gathered round the table during the summer, and I longed for the sunlight as I had never longed for it before. Less than 3 feet to my left the passageway led to the kitchen, and the stairs leading to the bedrooms above commenced in this passageway, but almost in the sitting room itself. Through the windows I could see the dim, motionless outlines of the trees. Not a leaf stirred, not a branch moved. A few moments of this awful silence, and then I was aware of a soft tread on the boards of the veranda, so stealthily that it seemed an impression directly on my brain rather than upon my nerves of hearing. Immediately afterwards, a black figure darkened the glass door, and I perceived that a face was pressed against the upper panes. A shiver ran down my back, and my hair was conscious of its tendency to rise and stand at right angles to my head. It was the figure of an Indian, broad-shouldered and immense, indeed the largest figure of a man I had ever seen outside of a circus hall. By some power of light that seemed to generate itself on the brain, I saw the strong dark face with the aquiline nose and high cheekbones flattened against the glass. The direction of the gaze I could not determine, but faint gleams of light, as the big eyes rolled around and showed their whites, told me plainly that no corner of the room escaped their searching. For what seemed fully 5 minutes, the dark figure stood there, with the huge shoulders bent forward so as to bring the head down to the level of the glass, while behind him, though not nearly so large, a shadowy form of the other Indian swayed to and fro like a bent tree. While I waited in an agony of suspense and agitation for the next moment, little currents of icy sensations ran up and down my spine, and my heart seemed alternately to stop beating and then start off again with terrifying rapidity. They must have heard its thumping and the singing of the blood in my head. Moreover, I was conscious as I felt a cold stream of perspiration trickle down my face, of a desire to scream, to shout, to bang the walls like a child, to make a noise or do anything that would relieve the suspense and bring things to a speedy climax. It was probably this inclination that led me to another discovery, for when I tried to bring my rifle from behind my back to raise it and have it pointed at the door ready to fire, I found I was powerless to move. The muscles, paralyzed by this strange fear, refusing to obey the will. Here indeed was a terrifying complication. There was a faint sound of rattling of the brass doorknob, and the door was pushed open a couple of inches. A pause of a few seconds, and it was pushed open still further without a sound of footsteps that was appreciable to my ears. The two figures glided into the room, and the man behind gently closed the door after him. They were alone with me between the four walls. Could they see me standing there, so still and straight in my corner? Had they perhaps already seen me? My blood surged and sang like the roll of drums in an orchestra, and though I did my best to suppress my breathing, it sounded like a rushing of wind through the pneumatic tubes. My suspense as to the next move was soon at an end. Only, however, to give place to a new and keener alarm, the men had hitherto exchanged no words and no signs, but there were general indications of a movement across the room, and whichever way they went, they would have to pass round the table. If they came my way, they would have to pass within 6 inches of my person. While I was considering this very disagreeable possibility, I perceived the smaller Indian, smaller by comparison, suddenly raised his arm and pointed to the ceiling. The other fellow raised his head and followed the direction of his companion's arm. I began to understand at last. They were going upstairs, and the room directly overhead to which they pointed had been until this night my bedroom. It was the room in which I had experienced that very morning so strange a sensation of fear, and but for which I should then have been lying asleep in the narrow bed against the window. The Indians then began to move silently around the room. They were going upstairs, and they were coming round my side of the table, so stealthily were their movements that, but for the abnormally sensitive state of the nerves, I should have never heard them. As it was, their cat-like tread was distinctly audible. Like two monstrous black cats, they came round the table toward me, and for the first time I perceived that the smaller of the two dragged something along the floor behind him. As it trailed over the floor with a soft sweeping sound, I somehow got the impression that it was a large dead thing with outstretched wings, or a large spreading cedar branch. Whatever it was, I was unable to see it even in an outline, and I was too terrified, even had I possessed the power over my muscles, to move my neck forward in the effort to determine its nature. Nearer and nearer they came. The leader rested a giant hand upon the table as he moved. My lips were glued together, and the air seemed to burn my nostrils. I tried to close my eyes, so that I might not see as they passed me, but my eyelids had stiffened and refused to obey. Would they never get by me? Sensation seemed to have left my legs, and it was as if I was standing on mere supports of wood or stone. Worse still, I was conscious that I was losing the power of balance, the power to stand upright or even lean backwards against the wall. Some force was drawing me forward, and a dizzying terror seized me that I should lose my balance and topple forward against the Indians just as they were in the act of passing me. Even moments drawn out over hours must come to an end sometime. And almost before I knew it, the figures had passed and had their feet upon the lower step of the stairs leading to the upper bedrooms. There could not have been 6 inches between us, and yet I was conscious only of a current of cold air that followed them. They had not touched me, and I was convinced that they had not seen me. Even the trailing thing on the floor behind them had not touched my feet, as I dreaded it would, and on such an occasion as this I was grateful even for the smallest mercies. The absence of the Indians from my immediate neighborhood brought little sense of relief. I stood shivering and shuddering in my corner, and beyond being able to breathe more freely, I felt no whit less comfortable. Also, I was aware that a certain light which, without apparent source or rays, had enabled me to follow their every gesture and movement, had gone out of the room with their departure. An unnatural darkness now filled the room and pervaded its every corner, so that I could barely make out the position of the windows and the glass doors. As I said before, my condition was evidently an abnormal one. The capacity for feeling surprise seemed, as in dreams, to be wholly absent. My sense recorded with unusual accuracy every smallest occurrence, but I was able to draw only the simplest deductions. The Indians soon reached the top of the stairs, and there they halted for a moment. I had not the faintest clue as to their next movement. They appeared to hesitate. They were listening attentively. Then I heard one of them, who, by the weight of his soft tread, must have been the giant, cross the narrow corridor and enter the room directly overhead. My own little bedroom. But for the instance of that unaccountable dread I experienced there in the morning, I should at the very moment have been lying in the bed with the big Indian in the room standing beside me. For the space of 100 seconds there was silence, such as might have existed before the birth of sound. It was followed by a long quivering shriek of terror which rang out into the night and ended in a short gulp before it had run its full course. At the same moment the other Indian left his place at the head of the stairs and joined his companion in the bedroom, and I heard the thing trailing behind him on the floor. A thud followed as something heavy falling, and then all became as still and silent as before. It was at this point that the atmosphere, surcharged all day with an electricity of a fierce storm, found relief in dancing flash of brilliant lightning simultaneously with a crash of loudest thunder. For 5 seconds every article in the room was visible to me with amazing distinctness, and through the windows I saw the tree trunks standing in solemn rows. The thunder pealed and echoed across the lake among the distant islands, and the floodgates of heavens then opened and let out their rain in streaming torrents. The drops fell with a swift rushing sound upon the still waters of the lake, which leapt up to meet them and pattered with the rattle of shot on the leaves of maple and the roof of the cottage. A moment later, and another flash even more brilliant of a longer duration than the first lit up the sky from zenith to horizon, and bathed the room momentarily in dazzling whiteness. I could see the rain glistening on the leaves and branches outside. The wind rose suddenly, and in less than a minute the storm that had been gathering all day burst forth in all its full fury. Above all the noisy voices of the elements, the slightest sound in the room overhead made themselves heard, and in the few seconds of deep silence that followed the shriek of terror and pain, I was aware that the movements had commenced again. The men were leaving the room and approaching the top of the stairs. A short pause, and they began to descend behind them, tumbling from step to step, I could hear the trailing thing being dragged along. It had become ponderous. I awaited their approach with a degree of calmness, almost of apathy, which was only explicable on the ground that after a certain point, nature applies her own anesthetic, and a merciful condition of numbness supervenes. On they came, step by step, nearer and nearer, with the shuffling sound of the burden behind growing louder as they approached. They were already halfway down the stairs when I was galvanized afresh into a condition of terror by the consideration of a new and horrible possibility. It was the reflection that if another vivid flash of lightning were to come when the shadowy procession was in the room, perhaps when it was actually passing in front of me, I could see everything in detail, and worse, be seen myself. I could only hold my breath and wait. Wait while the minutes lengthened into hours and the procession made its slow progress around the room. The Indians had reached the foot of the staircase. The form of the huge leader loomed in the doorway of the passage, and the burden, with an ominous thud, had dropped from the last step to the floor. There was a moment's pause, while I saw the Indian turn and stoop to assist his companion. Then the procession moved forward again, entered the room close on my left, and began to move slowly around my side of the table. The leader was already beyond me, and his companion dragging on the floor behind him the burden, whose confused outline I could dimly make out, was exactly in front of me. When the cavalcade came to a dead halt at the same moment, with the strange suddenness of thunderstorms, the splash of rain ceased altogether, the wind died away into utter silence. For the space of 5 seconds, my heart seemed to stop beating. And then the worst came. A double flash of lightning lit up the room and its contents with merciless vividness. The huge Indian leader stood a few feet past me on my right. One leg was stretched forward in the act of taking a step. His immense shoulders were turned towards his companion. In all their magnificent fierceness, I saw the outline of his features. His gaze was directed upon the burden his companion was dragging along the floor, but his profile, with the aquiline nose, high cheekbones, straight black hair, and bold chin, burnt itself in that brief instant into my brain, never again to fade. Dwarfish, compared with his gigantic figure, appeared the proportions of the other Indian, who, within 12 inches of my face, was stooping over the thing he was dragging, a position that lent to his person the additional horror of deformity, and the burden, lying upon a sweeping cedar branch, which he held and dragged by a long stem, was the body of a white man. The scalp had been nearly lifted, and blood lay in a broad smear upon the cheeks and forehead. Then, for the first time that night, the terror that had paralyzed my muscles and my will lifted its unholy spell from my soul. With a loud cry, I stretched out my arms to seize the big Indian by the throat and grasp only air, fumbled forward unconscious upon the ground. I had recognized the body, and the face was my own. It was the bright daylight when a man's voice recalled me the consciousness. I was laying there where I had fallen, and the farmer was standing in the room with the loaves of bread in his hands. The horror of the night was still in my heart, and as the bluff settler helped me to my feet and picked up the rifle which had fallen with me, with many questions and expressions of condolence, I imagined my brief replies were neither self-explanatory nor even intelligible. That day, after a thorough and fruitless search of the house, I left the island and went over to spend my last 10 days with the farmer. And when the time came for me to leave, the necessary reading had been accomplished and my nerves had completely recovered their balance. On the day of my departure, the farmer started early in his big boat with my belongings to row to the point, 12 miles distant, where a little steamer ran twice a week for the accommodation of hunters. Late in the afternoon, I went off in another direction in my canoe, wishing to see the island once again where I had been the victim of so strange an experience. In due course, I arrived there and made a tour of the island. I also made a search of the little house, and it was not without a curious sensation in my heart that I entered the little upstairs bedroom. There seemed nothing unusual. Just after I re-embarked, I saw a canoe glide ahead of me around the curve of the island. A canoe was so unusual sight at this time of year, and this one seemed to have sprung from nowhere. Altering my course a little, I watched it disappear around the next projecting point of rock. It had high curving bows, and there were 2 Indians in it. I lingered with some excitement to see if it would appear again round the other side of the island, and in less than 5 minutes it came into view, and there were less than 200 yards between us, and the Indians, sitting on their haunches, were paddling swiftly in my direction. I never paddled faster in my life than I did in those few minutes. When I turned to look again, the Indians had altered their course and were again circling the island. The sun was sinking behind the forest on the mainland, and the crimson-colored clouds of sunset were reflecting in the waters of the lake. When I looked around for the last time and saw the big bark canoe and its 2 dusky occupants still going round the island, then the shadows deepened rapidly, the lake grew black, and the night blew its first breath in my face as I turned a corner, and a projecting bluff of rocks hid from my view both island and canoe.